Welcome everyone to the Practical SQL Server HA show. It's another episode, and I am giving my developer friends some love. I used to be a developer, and I can't hate on developers, even though every once in a while they would do so. Well, not every once in a while, more often than not. They are, developers make apps. They write apps, they create, or they write code, they make apps. And of course, they're the ones that interact with the database. Now, even though I have been officially a data professional for more than a decade and a half, I spent my early days in my career as a developer. So I cannot really hate on my developer friends, which is why today's topic piggybacks on a conversation we had last episode about developers. This time, we're going to talk about what back-end developers and data engineers responsibilities are as far as high availability and disaster recovery is concerned. Like I said, in my previous life, I was a developer. I did front-end web development, or sometimes front-end application development, where you're creating UI, data, what's this, filtering and whatnot. I created I don't want to say beautiful designs as far as front-end apps are concerned, because I'm not really a visual design kind of guy. I had one of my students back then create the user design or interface. No, not interface, but the design in Photoshop, made it good, and then gave it to me to create the web controls, so the front end side of it, and the middle tier, meaning components, server side apps that would get called from the web front end. I don't know why I'm even talking about this. I'm no longer a developer. But the thing is, just like what I kept emphasizing in some of the previous episodes, that high availability and disaster recovery is not an individual sport. It is a team sport. And most of the times IT in general, we just pass the responsibilities over to our IT team, whether that's the server admin, sysadmin, storage admin, the DBA. We would pass the responsibility over to them for all HA and DR stuff, right? As developers, we just write code. I'm guilty of this. When I was a developer, all I really cared about was, is it working, right? Especially when there's faster cadence and quicker release cycles. We need to churn out code as quickly as we possibly can. And our main goal, my main goal, is that I just want it to work. If there are bugs in the long run, I will catch it in production, hopefully, right? And yes, sometimes bugs made it in production. Yes, and that's one of the reasons why we have to be a part of this whole team, thinking about high availability and disaster recovery. And again, giving some love to my developer friends, because I'm also one of them. But I'm also going to throw in data engineers in the mix. We have been inundated with data, massive explosion of data. In the past, it was the data administrators, DBAs, or people who are taking care of the data, responsible for that. But now, with the massive explosion of data, there is a specific job title or job role specifically for making sense of the data. Back then, it was a DBA making this happen. But together with back-end developers, they're the ones who are, again, from my own definition, making sense of the data. They would collect as many information as possible from different sources. Maybe it's a web API, maybe it's from a public data or open data from a government institution or weather, for instance, and then mix that with transactional data that the business is generating and make sense of it, make decisions. Sometimes as they operationalize it, they would hand it over to the data scientist to even more come up with meaningful insights behind what they've gathered within the data. Now, I know I'm describing a lot of these responsibilities. Backend developers are simply taking care of backend stuff, like for instance, having calls to an authentication mechanism or an authentication platform, or storing data into data sources or databases. But one of the reasons why I really wanted to point out that developers and data engineers have responsibilities as far as high availability and disaster recovery is concerned is because sometimes, like I said, not sometimes, most of the time we don't think about it as developers, data engineers. We don't think about it. Let the DBA, let the sysadmin, the IT team take care of that. But every code that you write that needs to interact with data needs, if you followed my previous episode, needs to really consider high availability and disaster recovery, right? I talked about that. Go back to the previous episode, watch it, listen to it, take some notes. But this time I want to talk about your responsibilities. If you are a back-end developer or a data engineer, you have responsibilities too as far as HA and DR. Grab your pen and paper ready, take notes. The first one is that you need to define the impact of your code in HA and DR. You need to understand the impact of your code to HA and DR. I was, for the past a week and a half now, I have been troubleshooting an issue with a client where they are running an availability group. And as I was going through the always on health extended event session and the SQL Server error log, I noticed that at one instance, one of the databases in the AG or in the availability group suddenly went in suspended mode. Of all the databases, it went into suspended mode. I looked at the trend, look at the patterns. It's not just this database, but in the past, what happened was it went into suspended mode, and then after a couple of seconds, it would fix itself, and then resumed data movement. So far, so good, nothing to worry about. But then, as I was looking into the SQL Server error log, as I was looking into the always on health extended event session, I started to see patterns. And that pattern got me into digging deep into what is really going on. Why is that? I looked at the transaction log backups, and at certain times within the day, there are transactions going on that would push the transaction log backups to grow at a certain size, which means it's unusual, right? And again, as a data professional and as humans in general, we can easily spot patterns if we just pay attention to these. In my case, I saw that a transaction log for specific times every hour is bigger than average. So I'm just going to throw out some numbers there. Say, for instance, your transaction log backups for a database is roughly around 50 megs every 10 minutes. But this specific transaction log backup is roughly 10 times more. And it is happening every hour, right? And again, me being the curious guy that I am just curious what's going on. And I started asking questions and figuring out. I ended up even looking at the transaction log backups, the contents, using some undocumented functions. And I noticed that there are massive amounts of transactions happening during this time, this specific date. And of course, if nothing's happening at 4 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, when nobody's using the system, something else might be causing the transaction log backup to grow at this particular time, right? Having a conversation, ask a bunch of questions, lo and behold, the developers have a specific module that generates data during this time of the day. And when we asked what the business logic was, they said, oh, yeah, I think we needed to fix this issue. We need to fix the function embedded within the module in order for it to not generate massive amount of data during this time of the day. Again, maybe something that you have written as a developer in the past, maybe something that you wrote a couple of years ago, maybe you've even forgotten about it. Or maybe it's something that you pushed into production as a fix, maybe a bug fix, maybe a feature fix, and you forgot about it. But because it is a part of the app, it started to affect HADR. In this particular case, the database went on in suspended mode. I am again, I'm still tracking down exactly what caused it to be into or to go into suspended mode for a long time, until I had to literally remove the database, put it back in the AG. But the point is, there is something in the app that is generating massive amounts of transaction log records that I found out using the log backups because of the trend. And it is caused by a module or a function within the app, and it's generating massive amounts of transaction log records. So again, know as a developer that your code has an impact in the overall HADR. Most of the time, the developers, they'll write their code, deploy it in production, and then forget about it. Unless, of course, you are an on-call developer where something happens in production, maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning, you get called in. You get called in. Man, I don't miss the times when I was being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning by either a phone call or a page or an alert because I was on call. And in this case, even the developers now are being included as part of the operations. Most of the time, they're not. So they're not even aware that something like this is happening. Like in this case, again, developers are not being called in. They're not being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning, so they don't know that this is happening, right? So as a developer, understand the impact, the effect of your code in HA and DR. In this case, if we didn't catch it soon enough, or maybe if we did and we tried to failover because the databases are not in sync because it was suspended, it would not do a failover, right? The failover would fail. Imagine what would have happened because the database is not in sync. 1 out of 12 databases in the AG, just one database in the AG not being in sync, let's say for a couple of minutes, and then something happened. Maybe the server rebooted. The cluster is there, obviously, for the purposes of high availability. But what could have happened because the database is not in sync, because of this module generating transaction log records, automatic failover could not happen. We would not be able to address any high availability issues, or in this case, failover wouldn't happen. So again, making sure that your code in your app clearly is not causing more issues or not causing DR to be impossible, right? Number 2, yes, second point. I know. Again, developers don't really think about this most of the time, but unless you become a part of the operations team taking care of high availability and disaster recovery and realizing that it was a code that the app is sending to the database that's generating these issues that eventually cause the database to be inaccessible, that's the only time that you would realize, right? Number 2 is that you have, as a developer, you have to regularly check in with IT. Check in, right? I know we're busy, there's so many things to do, but regularly check in with IT if recovery point and recovery time objective is still achieved. And again, you might be thinking, wait a second, why do I care about RPO and RTO? Why do I care about HA? I just need to write my piece of code. I just need to deploy this app in production. Why do I care? Again, if you are part of operations and if you get called in at 3 o'clock in the morning, you will be woken up, your sleep will be disrupted, and therefore you're going to be part of the team that gets into the war room to figure out what's going on. You have to check with IT if indeed HA is achieved. Alongside with it, are we meeting our recovery point and recovery time objectives? That goes to say you really have to be aware of it. Even though you're not directly responsible for it, you have to be aware of it. Again, your action as a developer Deploying code, generating massive amounts of transaction log records that could potentially cause databases to be in suspended mode is causing potential outage. You have got to be aware, number one, of the impact of your code in your HA and DR, and number two, whether or not, based on what you have, the code that you have in production, is not going to cause an outage that would break HA and DR and not meet your recovery point and recovery time objective. Like I said, if as a developer you don't really care about this, as a data engineer, right? Most of the time when data engineers would write a data pipeline, for instance, they would spin up a Docker container containing all of the components that they need, and then they'll hand it off to IT and say, hey, you go ahead and deploy this, unless, of course, they have a CI/CD pipeline that takes care of everything. But still, in the process, if their code ends up doing what I just described earlier, where it generated massive amounts of transaction log records, caused the database to be in suspended mode, how sure are you that what you are doing is not impacting recovery point and recovery time objectives? So yes, regularly check in once a month. Now, you may have your weekly stand-up. You may have you're following agile methodologies, and then you're reporting your progress. You may have code reviews. You may have all of these things. Ask the question, has anybody ever checked if our code is affecting HA and DR? Right? Ask that question. Or ask, I know most of the time it's just developers in the room talking during a meeting or stand-up. Ask, hey, have we ever asked IT what the recovery point and recovery time objectives are? Because you can contribute to how those are met. I remember when I was working on a project, man, this was more than a decade ago, working on a project, let's just say they host one of the most popular games in the world. And I remember having been in a room where the developers are, and these are backend developers. The front end, the design guys are on a totally different team. But these are backend developers taking care of the interaction between the different gaming consoles, the website, desktop app, and then they pass the data back to the database. And they know they have checks and balances on every single module, every single component. They knew if they ran, let's say they want to do unit testing, they knew how much log records are being generated by one person, by 2,500 people playing the game, by 10,000 people playing the game. Because on launch day, they were doing like wave launches, because people are from all over the world, and so they're doing wave launches depending on the time zone. So people in Asia Pacific would get the game earlier than those in North America, and then those in Europe, or Europe and then North America. And then they knew, if as they are doing their testing, they knew, oops, if a user played the game and they went on playing for this much, just as the amount of data that was generated, they knew where the data was, they knew what the impact is, and they knew, because they were, their databases are running on, back then it was still a failover clustered instance, they knew how much data gets replicated, not replicated, but generated. They knew if in case something went wrong with the database and a failover happened, they knew how much transaction log records need to be rolled forward or rolled back as part of the failover. Because it's a failover clustered instance, the whole crash recovery process happens. And they knew that they cannot have downtime for longer than 2 minutes. That was how critical it was. They cannot have downtime for longer than 2 minutes, or maybe a minute. Yeah, roughly a minute, between a minute and two. And so they were measuring everything. And so they were talking to the DBAs, they were talking to the sysadmins, they were talking to all the different teams. And mind you, these are backend developers. They knew that the code that they're releasing to production is definitely going to impact HA and DR. They knew that the amount of data that they're generating would be, small enough so that when crash recovery happens, they are still meeting their recovery objectives and service level agreements when a failover happens for I don't know whatever reason. It could happen, right? It's not a matter of, or rather, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, right? So, as a developer or as a team lead in the development team, check in with your IT people. Ask, what's our recovery point objective? What's our recovery time objective? They might be surprised that you're asking, but now you're now working on, you're in the same page with these people, because now you are concerned. Hey, if we run this module, or if we update this specific function and it generates this much transaction log records, would it be enough in case we fail over? Will the amount of transaction log records be enough for us to meet our recovery point and recovery time objective, right? So that's number 2. Number 3, which is very, very important, and I'm looking at my notes here. Address the gaps and work with other teams. Now you might be thinking, what's the difference between number 2 and number 3? Number 2 is just being aware, right? You can be aware and not do anything. Well, that's better than not being aware and not doing anything. You can be aware and not do anything, right? Once you are aware of your recovery point and your recovery time objectives, and I'm not just looking at the database, I'm looking at the entire stack. Because, and this is the thing, because as end users, they don't really care that it's a network problem, an app problem, a database problem, an abstraction layer problem. They don't care. They're going to pick up the phone and say, the system's down. So you got to be conscious about the entire stack and ask not just the IT team, but everybody else involved, right? So number 3 is address the gaps and work with other teams, right? If your module or if your function is generating massive amounts of data, or maybe you're in a distributed system, and you're writing that piece of code where it's opening a transaction because you want to do logging. It's opening up a transaction to the database while checking for the user that needs access to an authentication platform, and then closing the transaction. You might ask, hey, am I keeping the transaction long to a point where I'm generating massive amounts of transaction, and now SQL Server could not truncate the log during a log backup? Or maybe you did not consider scaling out, or maybe the function is generating massive amounts of transaction log records. I don't know. But the thing is, when you become aware and you start to see the gaps, then you can take actions on how to address those gaps. It's better to be proactive, although again, developers are busy, everybody else is busy. We are knee deep or neck deep into a lot of tasks that we need to do, and sometimes we don't even have enough time on our hands to fix this, right? And so it is challenging, and I can understand it could be very difficult just finding the time to even fix or suggest a fix, right? More often than not, this is what happens. An issue occurs, an incident happens. We do investigate, we do an RCA, and before you do the RCA, you fix the incident, address the issue. Everybody's happy. We, on the other hand, the IT, would start to do our RCA, what happened, investigate, figured out that it has something to do with the app, get back into the developers. They would say, there's nothing wrong with the app. We start investigating, rather we continue with the investigation until we pinpoint the exact app, the exact module, and then that's the only time that the developers would start fixing it, right? That's the typical life cycle, if I may say so. Typical life cycle. The developers would not address anything until it's causing production issues, it has caused a major incident, or they got called out, right? So rather than waiting for an incident to happen, like a major outage, or being called out during a stand-up, do small actions or take small steps to achieve whatever or address whatever gaps there are. And like I said, we can talk all day about uh, ideas. We can talk all day about what you found out during an investigation. But if you're not going to take action on that one idea or that one insight that you found during either a health check or during an RCA when an incident happened, then it is bound to happen again. And if you've probably followed some of the episodes that I've done in the past, I'm big on action items. One idea would and no one action item based on an idea is worth a million ideas, because the ideas are useless if you're not going to take action on it. I'm always looking at what are we going to do based on the insights that we got from this, right? Like I said, the case that I'm working on, we found out that it was a module. The developer started working on it, right? But we did not find out that there were issues with the app until we saw that the availability group had an alert for a suspended database. So again, it is what it is. We are all busy. There's just so much work to do. But if you can start, you don't have to, spend an entire day doing this. Look back at the code. What is the code doing? Is it going to be generating massive amounts of data? Is it going to take long time to do a transaction, or are we writing code that would require minute-long transactions? Is that going to impact high availability and disaster recovery? You wrote the code, you kind of have an idea, and so recommend modifications to the code based on how it would impact HA and DR. And like I said, ideas are useless if you're not going to take action on it. So number 3 is address the gaps. Work with other teams and make sure that you are, as a team, right? Not just on the database side, not just on the network, not just on the server side, but on the app side, but everything in as a whole, that you are all meeting the overall recovery point and recovery time objectives, right? So those are the 3 things. Number 1, as a developer and a backend developer and data engineer, understand the impact of your code in HA and DR. Dig deeper, right? It's not enough for you to just write code. The code that you are going to deploy in production will definitely have an impact. And most of the time, again, I cannot blame most of the developers, because most of the time it's performance. But what most people don't recognize is performance also affects high availability. If the app is not responding quick enough, the perception from an end user would think, oh, it's down. They just don't realize that the app is not responding, right? So understand the impact of your code in HADR. Number 2, check in with your IT team. Ask for the recovery point and recovery time objective, not just of the database, but the entire stack, from the application to the network. Or if you're looking at one app because you're responsible for that app and that app alone, ask, what's the recovery point and recovery time objective for everything that this app uses, right? And number 3, address the gaps. Take action based on what you were made aware of, based on what you found, based on either an incident that happened that required an RCA, based on your own investigation, or just based on the awareness that your code is actually causing some HADR issues. Take action, address the issue, right? You will be contributing more to the entire team and to your business and to your career, because now you're thinking big picture rather than just small details of what you have responsibilities over, right? You're now thinking big picture, which of course demonstrates your big picture thinking. It demonstrates your ability to lead, because now you're influencing people at this point, right? So those are the things, your responsibilities as a backend developer or data engineer, because data engineers also write code to make sense of the data, and sometimes their code is causing. I've seen it happen. I'm not even kidding, because this was a mistake that I did back then. I would write code. One of the things, and I share the story because people now talk about it as data engineering. Back then, we just call it making sense of the data, right? I wrote uh, an ETL process to parse unauthorized access to servers, right? Windows has a Windows event log, and we captured specific error numbers and events that pertain to unauthorized access, multiple logins that are either password failures or anything, any security related events. Dump it into a database. Have an OLAP database that would analyze that. And for me, that was something that I saw from beginning to end, because anytime we're seeing security anomalies, I just look at my database and my data warehouse and like, oh, I could figure out exactly where this incident came from and we could address it. Again, they call it data engineering now. We called it making sense of the data. That's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Again, tune in again for the next episode. And if your development team, needs to be familiar and aware, or if you're, I'm talking to DBAs and sysadmins, if you want your developers to be aware of the impacts of their code on HA and DR, and in your case, well, I don't really know how to communicate this to the development team, reach out. Use that link on the screen. Schedule a strategy session. Let's talk, right? Excuse me. I'm more than happy to explain to them what is the impact. Of course, that requires me looking at their code, which of course might require maybe a consulting engagement. But understand that everybody has a part to play in achieving high availability and disaster recovery. And I keep emphasizing throughout these episodes, HADR is a team sport. You can't just do this on your own, right? It's not just a database thing. It's not just a network, a server. It's not just an app thing. It's everything, right, that makes up the entire platform. So, right, reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation. You may eventually find out that you need an HADR solution for both your apps, for your middle tier, and your backend databases. So reach out. I'm happy to help in any way I can. That is about it for this weekend's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'm off to, I don't know where I'm off to, but it's a beautiful day today. Who knows? Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I'll see you again on the next episode.